So we're starting with macroeconomics chapter 8. The
Uh-huh.
Phillips curve and the natural rate of unemployment and inflation. So when we talk about the Phillips curve, it is centered on the negative relationship between unemployment and inflation. So what I'm trying to say is that for the Phillips curve, it's it's trying to let us to understand that there's an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. So it means as soon as inflation
Uh-huh.
increases, as soon as unemployment increases, the rate of inflation will drop. And if inflation is increasing,
Well,
unemployment will reduce. So there's always an inverse relationship between
uh-huh.
inflation and unemployment. Do you get my point or not, please?
Uh-huh.
Do you get
Yeah,
it?
I get your point.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to start here. I said, the Phillips curve is centered on the negative relationship between unemployment and inflation. This simply implies that a low rate of unemployment will result in a high inflation rate, while a high rate of unemployment will lead to a low rate of inflation. So it's always going to be opposite the case. If inflation rate is increasing, unemployment rate will fall. If unemployment rate is
Uh-huh.
increasing, inflation would fall. Do you know why?
Well,
Do you know why?
Uh, because when there is a high employment rate,
Yeah.
people wait, what is it?
People have more income.
Yeah, have more income.
So because they have more income, demand for
Then
goods and services would increase within the economy. So that
yeah.
will bring about demand pull inflation.
Uh-huh.
Do you get the point here?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the first thing I want you to understand about the Phillips curve. It's only talking about the negative relationship between unemployment and inflation. I think that point
Mm-hmm.
is clear there.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So we go to figure. Okay, now I have this inflation versus unemployment. When you look at this figure eight, look at this figure eight. When
Yeah.
you look at it, we figure out that as soon as the unemployment rate, the inflation rate is on the horizontal side, and this, yeah. So when you look at the inflation rate, here we
Mm-hmm.
have unemployment rate. As soon as inflation rate increases, the unemployment rate falls.
Yeah.
Look at the diagram. So it's simply telling us that whenever we have inflation, the unemployment will definitely affect it. So increase in inflation, reduction in unemployment. Reduction in unemployment, increase in inflation, like you said earlier about income.
Yeah.
So because we have so much money with us, based on the fact that employment is reducing, unemployment is
Mm-hmm.
reducing, it simply means people are engaged, people have jobs. And because people have jobs,
Yeah.
the demand for goods and services would increase.
Yeah.
That's one reason. Another reason is this: because unemployment is reducing, the demand for labor would increase. And if the demand for
Mm.
labor increases, wage rate is expected to increase. So firms
Yeah.
will incur more costs. As a result of that, they might have to push the high cost of production into consumers in terms of high prices. That will bring about
Mm-hmm.
cost push inflation.
Mm-hmm.
So low unemployment rate will bring about demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. I think the points are clear there.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's go to inflation expected. Let's go to inflation and unemployment. So we have the wage determinant and the price determinant. So for wage determinant, it's we're talking about W equals to expected P as a function of U and Z. What does W
Mm.
means? The W simply means the wage rate.
Wage.
Okay. Then
Mm-hmm.
The P to the power of E simply means expected price level as a function of unemployment rate and the exogenous variable.
I want to ask you, sir,
Yes.
the expected level,
Price level.
yeah, the expected price level
Yeah.
is the same thing as the expected inflation.
Expected inflation is when you talk about expected inflation, this is a target. We call it
Uh-huh.
inflation target.
Uh-huh.
That is set by the central bank. It's not the same as the
Uh-huh.
expected price.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Do you understand? Expected price level
Yeah.
is talking about the future price.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about inflation price, it means we are talking about the consumer price index, CPI.
Uh-huh.
So here we are talking about the expected future price of goods and services. Really, it might be inflated. It might be inflated or deflated. We don't know.
Uh-huh.
Do you get it?
Yeah, yeah, I
So that's
get
why
it.
we won't talk about inflation alone. It could be a negative inflation rate. So just
Mm-hmm.
put it in mind that the expected price is the price that we are thinking about in the future, which might be
Yeah.
an increase or a reduction.
Uh-huh.
So it's a function of unemployment and the exogenous variable. And when we talk about exogenous variable, we're talking about climate, change in population,
Mm-hmm.
the geographical situation. So these are things that are exogenous. They are beyond the control of firms.
Mm-hmm.
They are external factors. That's why we call them exogenous. So these things are what we put together to determine the wage within the economy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you get it or not, please?
Yeah, I get it.
Okay. Then we have the price determination or the price determinants. For price determinants, there are just two things that we need to know. The price itself, the expected price, the actual price level, the
Mm-hmm.
markup, and the nominal wage. So it is
Mm-hmm.
price is determined by
The
the markup
markup
and the
and
nominal
then
wage.
the minimum rate.
Nominal wage, that's wage that is not being adjusted with inflation. But when the wage is
Mm-hmm.
being adjusted for inflation, we call it real wage.
Real wage.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Any question about that?
No, not no, sir.
Okay, so inflation,
Sorry.
expected inflation, and unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
So we can talk about expected inflation to be expected price, okay, which is fine. But most of the time, we think about inflation, it could be negative inflation.
Yeah.
So if it is negative, that's deflation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's disinflation, which is a change in the rate of inflation,
Mm-hmm.
which is positive.
Yeah.
We call it positive inflation.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so we move on, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have inflation, expected inflation, and unemployment. So here we have the equation f, a function of uz must be equals to 1 minus alpha multiplied by u plus z. We know our z already to be the exponential or the exogenous variables. U is
Yeah.
unemployment, and the coefficient alpha is the coefficient of the
Mm-hmm.
related bargaining power of workers. So what I'm trying to say is this: we have unemployment and
Mm-hmm.
exogenous variables. They must be equal to 1 minus the coefficient of the bargaining power of workers multiplied by
Mm-hmm.
unemployment plus z. So the alpha there is about
Yeah.
how powerful employees are
Uh-huh.
in terms of how they bargain, in terms of how they negotiate their wages.
Uh-huh.
So if they're able to negotiate their wages at a higher rate, it affects the markup.
It's like the responsiveness of inflation, yeah?
Yeah, it responds to inflation, but it will respond to inflation because the markup would have increased. This is
Yeah.
how it works.
Uh-huh.
This is how it works. We have workers. If they are able to negotiate, if they have bargaining power, it simply means they know how to negotiate.
Yeah.
So because they know how to negotiate, it increases the wage rate paid to them by employers.
Mm-hmm.
So that adds to the markup, and that
Yeah.
increases the cost of production for firms. Then they wouldn't have
Mm-hmm.
any other choice than to inflate the price.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to you? Does it make sense or not? Are you with me?
I'm with you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. There's a relationship between the price level, the expected price level, and the unemployment rate.
Mm-hmm.
So the expected price is P to the power of E. There is a markup which can be based on based on different situations, maybe economic situation, whatever would happen. There's always going to
Yeah.
be a markup.
Uh-huh.
So the markup will be added to the price. Then we have our alpha, which is talking about the relationship, the relative bargaining power of workers. If workers are able to negotiate a better wage, it adds up.
Mm-hmm.
Employers will pay, but they will increase prices.
Yeah.
Do you understand?
Yeah.
Then, if that happens, unemployment would increase.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it is 1 minus alpha u plus z. Your bargaining power will determine if employment will increase or not.
Mm-hmm.
If workers do not have bargaining power, it means firms or employers will pay them lesser. Yes or no?
Uh-huh.
So
Yes.
because employers can pay lesser, it increases, it reduces the unemployment rate.
Yeah.
Do you get it? That's why there's always
Yeah.
going to be relationship between the price level, the expected price level, and the employment rate, unemployment rate.
Mm-hmm.
Do we get it, please?
Yeah, I get it. So when the employees don't know how to negotiate,
Negotiate.
yeah,
It
so
reduces the amount
it
employers will
reduces the
pay.
amount they get paid.
Yes. And that would
And if they're
that
powerful
would
and know how
lower
to
the
negotiate,
unemployment rate.
mm-hmm.
Does it make sense now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So that takes us to so three. Okay, we have the Philip curve is done. Inflation, expected inflation, unemployment. These are just notes. Let me just go down. The Philip curve, I'm going to explain this here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The Phillips curve and its mutation. We have pi as pi to the power of e to t. We
Mm-hmm.
call it expansion expected inflation rate. The pi means pi to the power of et means expected inflation rate
Mm-hmm.
must be equals to the actual inflation rate. Are you with me?
Okay. Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
so for unemployment rate, what will determine our unemployment rate? The determinant of unemployment rate is the markup with the exogenous variables and the bargaining power of employees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So these are the three things, these are the three factors that determine the rate of unemployment. The
Mm-hmm.
markup, the
The
markup, the
and the
exogenous variables, and the
yeah.
bargaining power of employees.
Uh-huh.
So which simply means that if our markup is increasing, if our markup is increasing, it will
Mm-hmm.
affect the wages and it will affect the unemployment rate.
Okay.
So that's why I wrote that the higher the markup or the higher the factors that affect wage settings, the higher the natural rate of unemployment. So if the markup is increasing, if
Mm-hmm.
markups are increasing, that means when we talk about markup, we're talking about cost. It could be cost of production, whatever factors that increases the cost for firms would increase the rate of inflation
The rate of inflation.
and it will
Uh-huh.
affect unemployment.
Uh-huh.
Do you get it?
Yes, yes.
So if it is wages, if wages are increasing, it will affect
Mm-hmm.
unemployment.
Uh-huh.
Do you get it? So that's why
Yes,
it
I
is.
get.
That's why we say the higher the markup, the higher the factors, the higher the rate of unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's clear.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. So that's what for the point is this for Philip curve, it's simply talking about markups, unemployment rate, bargaining power of employees and other variables that are beyond the control of firms. These are things that have to be put together to determine unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
Is it clear?
Yes, that's clear.
Okay. So go to figure 8.2. Are you there?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So inflation versus unemployment in the United States. So based on the graph we are looking up here for, the graph shows that there is inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. The higher the inflation rate, the lower the unemployment rate.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the inflation rate. As soon as look at 1969, the inflation rate, the higher the inflation rate, the lower the unemployment rate. The inflation rate is above 5%, and the unemployment rate
Mm-hmm.
is around 3.5.
Yeah.
So this graph is just simply telling us that there's inverse relationship, according to the Phillips curve, that there's inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation.
Mm-hmm.
So my conclusion here is this. Let me see the conclusion. Okay. So the conclusion is that the conclusion about the Phillips curve is that, and its mutation is that unemployment rate doesn't affect inflation rate, rather it affects changes in the inflation rate. So there is inflation rate and there's changes in inflation rate. They're
Mm-hmm.
not the same.
Yeah.
So changes in inflation rate means there is either disinflation or deflation.
Mm-hmm.
So there's gonna be, so the rate of if the rate of inflation today is 2.5, this does
Okay.
not literally mean that unemployment would increase or decrease.
Mm-hmm.
But a change in the inflation rate will bring about unemployment increasing or unemployment reducing.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's disinflation, like let's say it is 2.3 today, it moved from 2.5 to 2.3.
Yeah.
That means there's a positive inflation rate anyway, but there's a low inflation rate.
Mm-hmm.
So this will affect unemployment rate.
Mm-hmm.
So before unemployment rate will be affected, there must be changes in the inflation rate.
Mm-hmm.
Do you get the conclusion about the Phillips curve here?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The conclusion about it is that inflation does not change unemployment. Changes in inflation rate changes unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's clear.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So now we go to figure 8.3. Are you there?
Yeah, yeah.
So here, when you look at the inflation rate and the unemployment rate, there's no visible relationship between unemployment rate and inflation. It is scattered.
Mm-hmm.
So based on the fact that it is scattered, it simply means that the uh, the relationship between inflation and unemployment has literally disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
It's even from the first one, which talk about the Phillips curve, where there is relationship between inflation and unemployment. But for the fact that there's inflation does not really change unemployment. It simply means that it is scattered. There has to be a change in inflation rate before we have a change in unemployment rate.
Yeah.
I think it's clear.
Yeah.
Okay. So that takes us to the we got 8.2 is done. Milton Fried's. Okay, let's go down. Okay. Now, the theory ahead of the facts, Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So according to Friedman and Edmund, they argue that there is no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. For them, they don't believe that there's relationship between inflation and unemployment. They say they believe it's never going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it makes the Phillips curve to change its mutation.
Mm-hmm.
Friedman and Edmund argue that there's no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. As a result of that, the Phillips curve changed its mutation. So now the Phillips curve says that there's no relationship, okay, but there's what we call accelerationist.
Mm-hmm.
So for the accelerationist Phillips curve, it simply means that unemployment rate, a change in unemployment rate will lead to an increase in inflation rate. So we're not
Mm-hmm.
talking about unemployment and inflation anymore. Now we are focusing on accelerationist Phillips curve.
Uh-huh.
So for the accelerationist Phillips curve, it talks about unemployment rate leading to an increase in inflation rate. So there's going to be a change in unemployment rate because there's a change in the inflation rate.
Mm-hmm.
So look at what they wrote. They said, according to the Phillips curve, accordingly, the Phillips curve is a temporary rather than a permanent trade-off between inflation and unemployment that comes not from inflation per se, but from a rising rate of inflation, which results in an unanticipated inflation. So we call it unanticipated inflation because we cannot predict it. It just happens.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's no permanent trade-off, or there's no permanent trade-off anymore. But what we have now is what we call the accelerationist, which is based on
Mm.
changes in the rate of inflation that would affect the unemployment rate.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So, okay. I'm just going to read and explain, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yet it said high unemployment leads to decreasing inflation. Low unemployment leads to increasing inflation. We talked about that before now anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the simple relationship between unemployment rate and inflation rate disappeared. Based on the 8.2, it disappeared because they are scattered. So that is what Friedman and Edmond are saying, that there's no trade-off between inflation and unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this disappearance is what, yes, they call it accelerationist Phillips curve.
Okay.
So the point you have to understand about accelerationist Phillips curve is that the rate of inflation will change before unemployment changes, not
Uh-huh.
inflation.
Uh-huh.
I think you understand accelerationist Phillips curve here. It
Yeah.
accelerates because the rate of inflation is increasing. So if unemployment has to increase, it will lead to an increase in the inflation rate.
Mm-hmm.
And that will lead to what we call price acceleration. So there's
Acceleration.
price acceleration because unemployment rate, unemployment rate, and a rise in unemployment rate will be as a result of a rise in the changes of a rise or a change in the inflation rate. So if
Mm-hmm.
inflation rate is increasing, unemployment rate is expected to fall.
Yeah.
Are you with me, please?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay. And if the rate of inflation is reducing, unemployment rate, if the rate of if unemployment rate is reducing, the rate of
Uh-huh.
inflation would rise, and that will
Drives,
lead
yeah.
to price acceleration.
Uh-huh.
So low unemployment rate means the demand for workers would increase.
Yeah.
So if the demand for workers increases, it will lead to a price acceleration.
Yeah.
That is what we call accelerationist Phillips curve.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's clear now.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. That's the Phillips curve and its mutation. We go to the next one. I just want to be sure that we are not missing out on anything.
Mm-hmm.
8 point. Okay, down this. Okay, we go down. I want to be sure we are not missing anything. Okay, Friedman. Yes, we talked about the accelerationist. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so the Phillips curve and its mutation, figure 8.4. Yes. For figure 8.4, I did this one. It shows that Fed had largely achieved its goal of keeping inflation rate. Look at the inflation rate. We have the inflation rate around 2 points. It's not for Fed. Well, let me put it this way. The normal inflation rate should be between 2%.
Mm-hmm.
Anything above 2% is considered as a high inflation rate.
Okay.
Do you get the point here?
Yeah.
Okay, so figure 8.4 shows that Fed had largely achieved its goal of keeping inflation rate around 2% in the mid-90s. Look at the mid-90s. The inflation rate is around 2%,
Mm-hmm.
which is from 1.5 downward anyway. here we have
Yeah.
our estimated value to be estimated value for theta to be 1.5. So the inflation rate is still between 1.5 to 2.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So however, between 2002 to 2020, there was a stable negative relationship. It went,
Yeah.
that's the negative one. From
Mm.
2002 to 2020, it fell.
Yeah.
There's a trend. Below the trend is a negative.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what we call deflation
Deflation.
or a negative inflation rate.
Mm-hmm.
I think you get my point here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So this figure is just telling us, figure 8.4 is showing us how inflation target is being met. For Fed,
Mm-hmm.
is able to maintain the 2 point target because the rate of inflation here does not exceed 1.5.
Yeah.
So which simply means we are in between 2 points.
Mm-hmm.
But going forward to 2002, there's a
Yeah.
negative because
It's a,
it moves below the trend. So there's a
mm-hmm.
negative inflation rate until
Negative and
2020.
yeah.
I think it's clear.
Yeah, it's clear.
So that's about 8.4. The 8.4
Mm-hmm.
is just telling us about how inflation is being maintained and what happens between 2002 to 2020, which is what
Mm-hmm.
a negative inflation rate.
Yeah.
Okay, it's been explained here anyway. They said by the mid 90s, the Fed, okay, it's been explained what I just explained, what I just talked about here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's see. I think that's about it there. Okay. Now we go to the Phillips curve and its mutation.
Mm-hmm.
So here they said expectations of inflation that has become de-anchored. So when you talk about anchoring is talking about factors. What bring about there's the central bank of a country, the central bank. The
Yeah.
central bank
Sense.
has an inflationary target.
Mm-hmm.
So if the central bank is able to hold on to the inflationary target, it means it has been anchored.
Mm-hmm.
But if it is this, if there is the anchoring, it simply means the central bank is unable to hold on to the inflationary target. That means the inflation rate, the present inflation rate is above the inflationary target of the central bank.
Okay.
Do you understand anchoring and de-anchoring here?
Mm-hmm.
It is anchored if the central bank is able to maintain a stable inflation rate.
Mm-hmm.
It is de-anchored if the rate of inflation is higher than the inflation rate. The inflationary target, sorry, the rate of inflation or the present inflation is greater than the targeted inflation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand what anchor is here now?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Before we go to the role of supply shock, I think I need to explain something here. 8.4, wait, my 8.4. Okay, I explained 8.4, right? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think I explained 8.4, right?
Yeah. You
Okay,
explained right
okay.
before.
So the Phillips curve, anchoring, okay, okay. The role of supply shocks.
Mm-hmm. Of inflation.
We're going to the role of supply shocks, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. They said the role of supply shocks and COVID inflation.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just say, the previous section assumed that the three parameters, markup, exogenous, and bargaining power were constant, which implied that the natural rate of unemployment is equal. Okay, it's still talking about what we've talked about before now. When we talk
Mm-hmm.
about supply shock, let me just explain what supply shock is. Supply
Mm-hmm.
shock affects aggregate supply within the economy.
Mm-hmm.
Supply shock affects aggregate supply. It affects supply within the economy. That's what supply shock means. So I'm just going to take 7. Okay. So what are the reasons why we have supply shock? We could have supply shock based on external factors. Like when they said in the 1970s, the formation of OPEC. When talking about OPEC, Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, these are countries that are, Saudi Arabia is the countries that export oil, crude
Yeah,
oil.
yeah.
So these
The
are
price
exporting
shock.
countries. So based on the fact that they were able, the creation of OPEC brings
Uh-huh.
about a cartel. When you talk about cartel are group of businesses that come together or
Yeah.
organizations that come together to decide price, to decide output, to
Uh-huh.
put customers into vulnerability. That's what a cartel is.
Uh-huh.
Do you understand? So
Yes.
a cartel could form a monopoly, and when monopoly is being formed, it means there's only one supplier within the economy.
Mm-hmm.
So that will bring about inflation because they decide about the price. Does it make
Uh-huh.
sense or not, please?
Yeah, it makes sense, but like,
Okay. So what we're trying to say is that there are other reasons why we could have inflation aside unemployment.
mm-hmm.
So which are supply side shock and the COVID, which is mentioned here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So for supply side shock, like I told you, it could be as a result of an increase in cost of production.
Mm-hmm.
So now OPEC because with the inauguration of OPEC, price of oil increases. As soon as price of oil increases, it increases the cost of production for firms.
Yeah.
Do you understand? So they wouldn't have any other choice than
Yes.
to increase the prices of goods and services too.
Mm-hmm.
Does it make sense?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So that's the first point. Then they said it was also the case during the COVID crisis, with a major increase in the price of commodities. When the cost of non-labor inputs increases, firms pass on the high cost in prices, leading to an increase in the price level, given wages, thus leading to an increase in markup. So during the COVID too, price of goods and services increase, price of commodities increases. And as a result of that, it increases the cost of production for firms. They wouldn't have any
Mm-hmm.
other choice than to increase the prices.
Mm-hmm.
We call it cost push inflation.
Cost push,
Cost
push
push
inflation.
inflation.
Okay.
I think it's clear.
Yeah.
So we go on to the CPI
Yeah.
rate, figure 8.5. Are you there?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right. So we have the inflation rate and the energy price rate of change. So here they are telling us that there's inflation as a result of a rise in the price in the energy price.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so figure 8.5, the inflation rate exceeds Fed's 2% target in mid 2022. Look at 2022, mid of 2022. The rate of
2022.
inflation is more than 2% in the mid of 2022.
Uh-huh.
Do you see it there?
Yeah.
Okay. So, so we are just trying to explain what this graph is talking about. So the inflation rate exceeds Fed's 2% target in mid 2022, but start decreasing
Mm-hmm.
in the third quarters of 2022. The third quarter of 2022, the inflation reduces, start reducing. Look at the third
Yeah.
quarter, the first, the second, the
Yes.
third, before the last quarter.
Yeah.
Do you see it?
Yes.
So it exits in the second quarter. Going towards the
Mm-hmm.
third quarter, it starts reducing.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the last quarter,
Yeah.
it reduces
Yes.
to around 3%.
Mm-hmm.
Though it still exceeds the target, which is 2% of Fed, but at least it reduces.
Yeah, it reduces.
Yeah. And also, when look at this map, it also shows that there was negative inflation rate. There was
Yeah,
deflation.
in 2020.
Yeah, in 2020, the first, the second, and the third quarter of 2020.
Yeah.
And this was as a result of COVID and energy price rate.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think it's clear.
Yeah, it's clear.
So figure 8.5 is just telling us the relationship between the price rate of energy and inflation,
Mm-hmm.
which also includes COVID.
Yeah.
So we have inflation here. We have a rise in inflation based on the fact that energy prices increases, and when energy prices fell, the rate of inflation also fell.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's clear.
Yeah.
So that takes us to inflation rate and a measure of shortages.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about inflation rate and measure of shortages, there's an increase in the rate of inflation between 2019 and 2020 because the tension
Mm-hmm.
between the USA, Russia, and China, which disrupted supply chain. So why do we have inflation? Here, another reason why we could have inflation is because of shortages.
Mm-hmm.
So when there's shortage, it simply means demand increases more than supply.
Yeah.
So if demand increases more than supply, there will be excess demand, and that will bring about a rise in price.
Yeah.
So now there is shortage there's shortage across the world because there's tension between USA, Russia, and China.
Yeah.
So this tension affects supply chain. And when we talk about supply chain, we're talking about how goods move in and out of
Yeah.
countries.
More. No. Mm-hmm.
So that brings about shortages.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's another reason why we could have inflation. We have inflation based on unemployment. We have inflation based on prices of commodities.
Mm-hmm.
And we have inflation based on shortages.
Yeah.
Any question about that?
No.
So we have 8.7.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So figure 8.7, like I wrote, it shows here we have a 1 year forecast and a 10-year forecast.
Mm-hmm.
We have the 1 year forecast and 10-year forecast and the inflation rate. So for the 1 year forecast, inflation rate increases.
Yeah.
But it increases. I wrote
Yeah. Yeah.
the 1 year forecast increased, but the 10-year forecast only reached a peak of 2.4. But for the
Yeah.
10-year forecast, it only reached a peak of 2.4.
Yeah.
Do you understand?
Yes. Yes.
It is slightly, which is like in 2022, which is slightly above first target rate of 2%. So anytime we
Mm-hmm.
talk about inflation rate, we have to think about the Fed target.
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand? Which is always 2%. So anything
Yeah.
above
Yeah.
2% means that it has been de-anchored. We are unable to maintain the inflationary target.
Uh-huh.
Do you understand?
Yes.
Okay. So that's just about 8.7. 8.7 talked about the 1 year forecast and the 10-year forecast. In 1 year, there is
Mm-hmm.
an increase in inflation, but for 10 years, there's a fall in inflation rate.
Mm-hmm.
It is slightly above 2%, which is 2.4.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we go to the relationship between unemployment. Here they said the relationship between unemployment and inflation depends on how wage setter form expectations. So
Mm-hmm.
as soon as there's inflation rate,
Yeah.
wage rate is expected to rise. Why? If inflation increases, inflation reduces the value of money. Do you know that?
Mm-hmm.
So it simply means if there's inflation, the level of my consumption would fall.
Yeah.
And if I still want to maintain my state of consumption, my level of consumption, it means I have to negotiate with my employers to increase my salary or my wages.
Yeah.
Do you understand that? So,
Yes. Yes.
so for that to occur,